Hello, I'm Liz Moseley and I'm the editor for today's Open News meeting. Thank you very much for being here. Hope you've all enjoyed the long weekend. I experienced sun hot enough to require SPF factor 25 and snow on the same day in London at the weekend, which is very exciting and incredibly difficult to get the outfit right. Nice to see you, nice to be back. There's no cocktails today, I'm afraid, just chat. Ellen Halliday, my colleague, is in the chat. Thank you, Ellen. We're going to get straight into it. Now, I hope he's here on time. Let's just check. My colleague, Matthew Dancona, is a troublemaker, as we know, and he's been making trouble on Twitter with the following, and I quote, "If we just called them vaccine certificates, everyone might calm down a bit and realise that far from curtailing our freedom, they will massively expand it." Matthew, would you like to explain yourself to the group, please? Hello.
Not enormously, but I don't think I've been left with much of an option. So that's probably one of those tweets that, as they say, won't age well. In fact, I think it started not aging well from the moment I pressed send, because I certainly didn't expect the Spanish Inquisition, which is what I got.
969 comments.
Yeah, no, I'm still going. I mean, it's a festival of love. It really is. So let me try and explain what I was trying to say, and obviously didn't quite get across. The origin of the whole idea of having some sort of COVID certification or vaccine passport or monstrous intrusion by Big Brother or whatever you want to call it, was really very simple and very practical, and it started to be seriously discussed about the beginning of the year, which was when there's when there's a final exit from all this, there's going to be a period when there's partial relaxation of what are called NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions, i.e. lockdowns, social distancing, and so on. And whenever it comes, the point at which both doses of the vaccine have been administered to the adult population, and that's going to be quite a period of. I mean, now looks like it probably both doses will have been administered by around about the end of August. About 5 million people have already had both doses, so that's where we are. And there was a sort of practical question about there'd be this period where businesses and movie houses and theatres and venues and restaurants and so on would want to open up, but there'd be, if you like, a mixed bag, and there would be some people would have had the vaccine, others wouldn't, some would have had COVID, others wouldn't. And how could you enable as many people as possible to live as normally as possible during those months? So the idea was originally there'd be some sort of vaccine certificate, probably a slightly posher version of the cards that you get when you had your dose. Proof of the fact that you'd had COVID if you had, which is relatively easy to get from your GP, or evidence of a recent test. And they were fairly confident, and they remain fairly confident, that lateral flow testing will be available at scale to make this happen. So that was the original idea. And the most important aspect of this was that it was a temporary measure. It was something, it wasn't trying to sort of invent a kind of authoritarian state. It was to try and create a bridge, if you like. So that's what I support. I support something that enables us to get from A to B, which doesn't mean that people are locked in until July, effectively, or so constrained in their access to the office and pubs and restaurants and movie houses that really they're not living relatively freely. What's come out, I'm afraid, is, how to put this, more like test and trace than the vaccine rollout. So I was very dismayed when I watched the press conference yesterday, because this notion of a whole new app with a QR code, when this government mentions an app, something terrible is going to happen. So that was my first feeling. My second feeling was that this was going to trigger every single person who loves using the word Orwellian in a tweet in Britain, which it did. Although it's worth bearing in mind the polls show that about 60 to 70% of people are behind vaccine certificates. So where we've ended up is, I think, a practical idea that could have been of huge, practical use, now descending into a classic Boris chaotic situation. I'm not even sure that what they're proposing at the moment is going to get through the House of Commons, because quite rightly, something like this, you absolutely have to have a parliamentary vote. And he's already got Labour saying they won't vote for it, and 40 Tory backbenchers saying they won't vote for either, which wipes out his majority. So at the moment, it's a non-starter. But I still think that some sort of, fairly fast and furious system that just enabled more people to get out and about, spending money, having fun, with obvious exemptions. There's people saying on Twitter, I'm a pregnant woman, what about me? And the answer is, of course, the whole point is a system where it's safer for you as a non-vaccinated person to go out and about, because that in those settings where you go, everyone will have demonstrated that they've had their vaccine, they've had COVID, or they've been tested. But as is often the case in our kind of social media driven society, we've ended up into a situation where you're either wholly in favor of this measure, or you think that it represents the arrival of Big Brother's foot stamping on the face. So it's what they call in Whitehall suboptimal.
Thanks, Matt. What do we know? So you're kind of, in summary, you're in favour of a temporary, so not ad infinitum, way of getting us from A to B.
Yeah.
And like you say, carefully thought through, but obvious exemptions apply, and all of that would come out in the wash, all of that stuff. What do we know? Because this is, again, I haven't been able to figure it out. I'm not vaccinated, so I'm sort of interested to know what I'm going to need to satisfy, what criteria I'm going to need to satisfy in order to be able to do the things I want to be able to do come May or whenever it is. So what do we know about where you do and don't have to have this thing? Let's say it's an app, let's say it's I don't know.
What they're proposing is, which is just to emphasize, lest there be another Twitter storm, because I've got work to do today. It's not what I was suggesting. Is an app that combines all three elements. And this is where the legitimate concerns of people arise, which is that it would record either whether you'd been vaccinated or had COVID or had a test,
a
negative test recently, within 2 days, I think it is. Now, the reason that the fears about that are legitimate is because there's a huge difference between you as an individual going to your favorite restaurant or wherever it might be, or a gig, and producing your vaccine certificate or your evidence from your GP that you've had COVID, or your test result, and a aggregated, centralized database. They're totally different things. And I think that's where the government has gone towards the less ideal version, because I actually don't think we need a system of the sort that they're suggesting. I really don't. I mean, unless there is a massive supply problem with vaccine doses, which there could be. I mean, there's obvious, AstraZeneca is obviously experiencing some problems, but basically things are going to plan. Most adults should have had both doses before the end of the summer, at which point, we'll probably need a third dose to allow for variants later in the year, but things should be on track for total relaxation. Now, people may carry on wearing masks, they may carry on actually practicing a form of social distancing, but it's this transitional period that's the key.
Thanks, Matt. I might come back to you in a bit. I think Chris is on the call. I'll come to Chris Cook in a sec. But Thomas Jackson, you've just put a note in the chat that I'm glad you have, because you're sort of expressing an emotional response that I too am having to this, whilst at the same, I mean, I very rarely get the opportunity to identify with the youth, so I'm really seizing this with everything I possibly can. But whilst at the same time I'm having an emotional reaction to it and feeling a bit, as the numbers of people who've been vaccinated tick up, and I know I'm being ridiculous, the more I feel like I'm literally in the bottom half of adults in the country who count. And I know that is ludicrous, but I have definitely experienced it. Go on, tell me about how you're feeling about this.
I think it's just, as a young person through this pandemic, I'm currently a gap year student, having left school last year. And when I left school, I was given an amazing message from Boris Johnson on social media that was very much saying, thank you for everything you've given up and all of that. And which I know, compared to how much people have lost since, is a very much a first world problem in all of this. But speaking to friends through university and all the experiences that have been changed for us has been significant. And I just feel that the introduction of this vaccine certification program, or vaccine passports, however you want to call it, really feels just like another point where my generation really wants to be trying to get back to university and trying to get back into, experiencing what it's like to be a young adult. It's another loophole that we're having to jump through at the moment. And especially if it comes in before I'm even able to get a vaccine dose, I'm going to feel so marginalized in that, when actually my generations are probably the people who want to be going to pubs and nightclubs and whatever the most at the moment in some ways.
So Thomas, given what Matt said, and I believe he's right, that it's not just you have to have a vaccine or you can't go to the pub. I think there are it's a vaccine or a note from your GP to say you've had COVID, therefore have natural immunity, which I don't know how long that lasts for, but there's a period of time. And then, or you've done a negative test, lateral flow test, which people can have 2 a week. You go and get one from the place near your house or whatever the thing. What about is it the testing thing that would necessarily act as a throttle on your ability to do your normal life just because it's admin and it's a hassle? Is that the thing?
I think it's also how long this testing window will last as well. That, it makes spontaneity very hard as a young person on it. That if I want to go and meet if a friend texts me and says, do you want to go to the cinema this weekend? I've got to book myself a test, get myself a test. And I think that it's a real blocker in that. And I think when my generation can access vaccines, then I'm not nearly as opposed to it. I think there are still some certain issues on how you force people to take a vaccine if they don't want to and whatever. But I think whilst my generation can't access a vaccine as easily, it just feels like it's this real divisive measure. And I think for me, what makes it even worse is the fact that I think, speaking to my friends, and some of whom, haven't been always 100% careful, but the majority of whom have been very careful. We've been consistently sort of said, oh, it's the young people being the biggest transmitters, or is all of this going on? And I think to feel accused a lot of the time and then having our lives keep clamped down, it feels quite, not oppressive is the right word, but sort of a bit being pushed to one side. And I think it is definitely an emotional response completely. And factually, I don't disagree with the scheme entirely, but it's just the battering ram that feels like I'm keep being hit with this year.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Thomas. I might go to Daniel, actually, my old pal Daniel Dipper. I've not spoken to you for a bit, Daniel. Are you there?
Yeah, hello.
Hiya. So you've just said, I didn't know this, that you can order a pack of lateral flow tests. Is it just like off the website, you can get them delivered to your house and then you kind of got them in like your masks, you have your tests, you have your masks?
Yeah, I don't know the exact workings of it, but it was announced yesterday that you can get the tests ordered to home, and I think they're in like a pack of 7, and they are free, and I think they will be from the government website, and that's launching from this Friday.
Okay.
So yeah, I think they should be available.
And you're relaxed about this certification thing in general?
Yeah, I'd say I'm relaxed about it in the sense that if it allows us to unlock more, then I'm willing to go for that, because I mean, I've seen some of the things from like Imperial in recent days and the modelling that's been going on, and I'm quite concerned about some of the things that are being said about if we reopen fully in June, which is the plan, then we could be leading to tens of thousands of deaths. And I think I was reading it in the Times possibly this morning, that just a small margin in regards to if a variant becomes ever so slightly more infectious, or if vaccination rates aren't quite exactly where they predicted. They're predicting that'll increase the number of deaths by January next year by tens of thousands. And I'm very keen that, we want this to be an irreversible opening. So yeah, I'm willing to accept the certification scheme. I think that I absolutely agree that it can't just be vaccines because of course young people haven't had them.
Yeah.
But I'd be willing to have a lateral flow test, yeah. And I definitely think that when it comes down to that, then yeah, I'd mostly order a pack, have that at home, and I see that as a cost I'd be willing to pay to be able to access these other things.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Daniel. Nice to see you. I just watching some comments in the chat that Thomas referenced as well. I think that there is a definite we just need to be mindful that it's not only young people that want to go out and go to the pub and do fun things. That's the sort of, I think everybody's keen to get up and get running on that one. So fair point, Andrew. Phoebe, I just want to bring in this thing that you're mentioning. I'm interested in the practicalities of this, right? And I may have mentioned this, I can't remember, I may have mentioned it last week, that in conversation with Helen Dickinson, who runs the British Retail Consortium, her big issue really with vaccine certifications or COVID certifications, whatever it is frontline staff having to check it off. I suppose one of the benefits I can imagine of the app thing, when we got used to using the Test and Trace app, it was relatively easy and you sort of zapped your QR code as you wait. So there's a sort of argument in favour of that. But if you have to be the person who says, I'm really sorry, you can, but you can't, that's an issue. And you're talking about staff safety in executing this, right?
Yeah, so something like that happened when I was in London, right? We were kind of central London. It was in that weird little bit where everyone was using Test and Trace and everyone posted out to help out. So I think pre-September, and we're sitting in quite a small pub, so not really much social distancing, very London, tiny little one. And someone comes up to the door with his two sons, and he says, you know, and the guy behind the bar goes, can you just scan yourself in? And he goes, but I don't want to, blah, 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 blah. And we're sitting there, and we're like, okay. And he's like, I don't want to. And he's like, well, you can't come in. And he gets quite like rowdy about it. And he's like, and this guy is clearly trying to do this as well as serving customers. And we chatted to him after, and he's like, you know, I've got reduced staff. Most of my staff are on furlough. How am I meant to police the door? In, you know, most situations, it means an extra person. It means someone's job is literally to like check people off and to do that. And you know, you've seen the same things in train stations. I've seen people, you know, get angry when they've been told to wear a mask. That's like an extra burden on hospitality staff. And this is kind of where we're going with it, right? Is at the cinema, what if someone comes up and says, well, I don't need one, COVID's not a real thing, blah, 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 blah. And that staff, and it's on top of that, you've got staff safety in terms of literally COVID. It just feels like it's great if you can say certification, but how do you actually manage that in most hospitality businesses? You know, that's where my worry is. And someone who's worked in hospitality as well, you know, it's hard enough as it is, let alone adding on that like extra barrier, whatever, every time someone comes in, you know, your dad can come in, but your two kids can't. You know, how do you manage that?
I suppose the choice though for those businesses is you either operate with the system, with the certification system, and therefore you are allowed to be open and you are allowed to trade and you can have customers, and you just kind of suck it up one way or the other, make it work, or you stay shut. I suppose that's what the sort of the consideration is, because it isn't safe to be open and it's a complete free for all. So I don't know what the bit in the middle is where you're somehow set up to manage the door appropriately, although, you know, remembering that, as Matt said, this is for a finite period of time. So I'm not sure what the halfway point for it is, but I agree with you that it's a material consideration. It certainly seemed to be the woman from the British Retail Consortium. I'm going to bring in, if I can, Judith Smith, who's made a couple of interesting remarks in the chat. Judith, what do you think about all this?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I can't form an opinion, to be honest. Part of me objects, I think, to, you know, the big brother ideas, and I'm such a skeptic about this current government, so everything has to be underpinned with that. However, you know, I'm just fed up of being stuck indoors, not having spontaneity and freedom and so forth. So, you know, I could see why people would want such a system. I've had one vaccine. I'm really looking forward to getting my second one, and allowing me more access to my family, more important than anything else. So I came on here specifically because I thought maybe someone could convince me about, what the new system should be. I don't like the idea, incidentally, and I did just add it there, that test and trace, which has been an absolute disaster, but has been massively funded to some of the Tory friends and backers, and I really, really do feel angry about that. And so I wouldn't want to be subject to a system that is pushing that sort of profiteering group of people to benefit from what really should be a national scheme that benefits us all. And that, that is something I really do feel strong about.
Thanks, Judith. Nice to see you, and nice to see your exciting garden background with giant.
If only that summer would come again.
Well, it's on its way, I know it. Chris, you're there with your little hand up.
I think the thing that is underappreciated in lots of this conversation is about the timescales we're really worrying about here. So there's the reports that came out last night published by Sage from Imperial and Warwick and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine all point to the prospect of another outbreak later in the year. They expect, even on a sort of central sort of estimates, that we'll have another 15,000 deaths between June of this year and June next year. That is assuming there's not a sort of mass, a new variation on the virus that means it escapes. They expect that we're going to need a second round of vaccination. So we're not really talking about this summer. We're really talking about probably the autumn. I think the point of this is to mean that when we have to confront what will then be like the 9th wave, whatever it is, we have a slightly different set of tools in the locker, so that we can keep some things open without the sort of same level of disruption. But I think it shows that the government's capable of learning, which is an exciting and novel thing.
Yeah.
But the reports that came out last night imply that with an unfair wind, when the stuff we can't really control, like the emergence of a new variation has a higher R rate, or a new variant that escapes vaccines, we could easily have another 100,000 deaths.
Yeah.
Right? This is the sort of, it's not over.
Chris, is that team, did you say it was from Imperial, that report that's been reported this morning? Is that the same team that did the original really scary Imperial report, the very beginning, at 500,000?
I don't know if it's exactly the same team. It's the same institutional bit, but I don't know if it's the same individuals.
And so your point of view on this specific question of the roadmap we can see to the end of June now, as it's set out by the government, and the requirements that are on the table being considered, whether they get through Parliament or not, of COVID certification, in general, you're like, well, yeah, because the autumn coming, it's going to be bad anyway, so why would we hasten?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that comes through in the report is they mention offhand that they only expect 61% of the population to be protected by a tool. That's the current plateau.
What the top amount of people?
And that's because we're not planning to inoculate under 18s yet. Mm-hmm. We probably will, because of that, to get that number higher, and because the vaccines are not 100% effective. If it turns out that the vaccines are better than they're currently quite conservative about how good they think the vaccines are, but if the vaccines are better at preventing spread and are better at preventing serious disease than the sort of current fairly conservative assumptions, then things might be better. But it's really planning for the fact that next winter could be surprisingly similar to this one. They actually say, one of the things they say is that we could end up with a situation, it's pessimistic but plausible, we end up with as many admissions in the next wave as we had in this one that's just gone, the January surge, based on a much larger outbreak, because there'll be more people protected, so you'll need to have a much larger set of infected people to get the same number of people into hospital. But they think that's plausible and possible, particularly if it's a more dangerous variant. So I think we shouldn't think about this as about the unlocking that we're about to go through. This is about preparing for what happens when the weather turns in the autumn, really.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Chris. I'm going to bring in a couple of people from the chat. I'd like to talk to Yulia, if you're there, Yulia Dumitris, and then Lillian as well, because you're having a back and forth about lateral flow tests. Now, we talked a lot about lateral flow tests a few months ago when we were trying to figure out, well, what's test trace working for starters, and what do the tests do and what do they not do. Yulia, you're talking about the app and people not being able to use it and all that.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm always on my daily walk during these meetings. So
That's okay. It's all good. Chris was in his garden last week.
Yeah, for me it's the app in terms of I don't believe there's any need for a new app. We do have an app. It didn't really work, but they can be updated. So I don't really understand why we need a new plan, a new app, a new system when we already have something there that might be improved. And then during the eat out and help out time, we had quite a lot of, well, in my local pub, we had a lot of older people who'd come in and they honestly couldn't function a smartphone. They didn't know how to use it. So they would write down their details on their own, on like the bar's notes. They had some sort of a record keeping system there. So I'm confused. How would have they taken that into consideration? I just think it's all done really hastily. And I don't understand why there is a need to start something from scratch again, because we could just work on what we have.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's where I am right now with this.
Thanks, Yulia, and enjoy your walk. I certainly would be interested to know. I can see Chris and a couple of others have mentioned the plan is to use one of the existing NHS-based apps and sort of add a widget into it, I guess. It would certainly be interesting to know who the team are of people that are working on that, so we don't end up in the mess that we originally did with Test and Trace. Although actually, once the Test and Trace app came out, it sort of seemed to broadly work relatively quickly, not straight away, but relatively quickly. It seemed to broadly do what it's supposed to do, notwithstanding Yulia's points about people being included or excluded according to their sort of technical proficiency. Lillian, you're a COVID vaccine volunteer, so you're in a vaccination centre a lot of the time, I'm guessing.
Yeah, some of the time, yeah.
And you're talking about these lateral flow tests and about the efficacy or otherwise of them.
Yeah, I don't completely know how efficient they are, but they seem to be okay. They are a first stage, if you like. They're the rough first draft, and then if one goes wrong, then you have a PCR test to follow up. Yeah. I mean, as volunteers, if we take one, then we just have to sit and wait and presumably be escorted over to the test centre, which is the other side of the road. But I do want to pick up the last thing. I spotted last week that there have been changes to the Test and Trace app, which I think would make way for a passport. And yes, there are systems in place if people don't have smartphones, because quite often they can use their smartphones for checking in for their vaccination. So there will always be something in place, because I'm well aware that lots of people don't have smartphones.
Yeah.
But more interestingly, the thing that I'm really interested in is some of the civil liberties implications of this, and why some people are so much against it and why some people are for it. And I really came here today to try and find out, as one or two other people have said, to try and find out what some of the arguments are. But I think, as Matt said, it's about the process as much as anything else, not about the principle.
Lynn, what's your sense of why people are upset about it? There's a sort of feeling, people say, I hear it said on the radio, you know, we're privacy-loving Brits and privacy is precious to us as a nation, and that's sort of instantly why people are agitated about this. But I don't really understand the bridge between, I want to be let out of lockdown, I want everybody to be safe, I want the economy to get going again, but I don't understand the bridge between those 2 points. What's your sense?
No, I mean, I think there's quite a lot of, to be honest, I think there's quite a lot of cant in this, mainly coming from sort of libertarian end of things, because there is so much privacy that we have given up. The whole Facebook, WhatsApp, all of that, Practically everything you do now, you have to give an email address and your date of birth. I mean, all sorts of things to, you know, to book tickets for a show or something like that. You have to give up vast amounts of information. There's also already the Test and Trace app. There's the NHS computerized records. So from that point of view, I don't get it. But I do say it does depend on whether it's some kind of central database and how that's managed, and whether or not one has control over it. I mean, for me, the thing that we desperately need in this country is a law like the law in Estonia, which means that people actually have the ownership of all their data. And I think that's really the way we've got to go. But in principle, having a little card, a laminated card or something to say, yeah, I've been vaccinated, is fine, as you know, but then we need to consider about people who may not want to get vaccinated. I mean, my personal opinion is that for most people, I think vaccination is a great thing. And certainly all the people I see are, well, obviously they're self-selecting, but they are absolutely cock-a-hoop about it. Some of them are a little bit worried. Some of them are a little bit unsure, but they sense that that's really the only way to go. Just as it is when you're traveling and you might need a cholera or a Hep A or something.
Yeah.
Vaccination to travel.
Thanks, Lillian. Nice to see you. I'm going to go to Sudi, my friend Sudi. She's there laughing. Hiya, Sudi. Nice to see you. Let's unmute Sudi so we can hear her. There we go. Hiya.
Cross. I'm being a grumpy old woman, which I'm not.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah, but I don't know. What do you want me to talk about?
Well, you've been talking about the accuracy of flow test. You've been talking about your friend who's very worried about taking the vaccine and how you persuade. I couldn't tell if it was a him or a her, but
it was a him. Yeah. Well, I said he can't go out with me if he doesn't have it. So we'll see how effective that is.
Enough, surely.
I would have thought so. Yeah. But you know, and I've answered a lot of his concerns. But I mean, it's very, very real. My sister-in-law is a GP, and you know, the government they seem to and no wonder they're so, you know, people are so resistant. They've shoved that whole, you know, research about why, say, Afro-Caribbean men are more, you know, seem to, you know, be more likely to get the disease. Kind of, we haven't heard anything more about that, nor have they really addressed people, you know. If scientists, you know, say a Black scientist would address this, take it up with people like him, who, you know, was a kind of a thought leader, it would make some difference. But everyone's just complaining about it. That's one thing. The other thing is, to me, I wouldn't feel safe if, you know, people just had a lateral flow test and we were all kind of hanging out together. I know that they're not very, well, I understood they're not very accurate. Maybe it's wrong. I mean, you know, my son had one the other day. He wasn't convinced, he was still unwell. And then he had the other and it was still negative. So, you know, maybe it is. I don't know. I haven't ever had one.
I think the thing about the lateral flow test, isn't it, Sudi, that they're primarily people who have no symptoms, and even though they're not accurate, they're nowhere near as accurate as the other test. It's just a way of filtering out some of the risk. I think that's kind of the idea.
We're filtering out enough of the risk. I mean, for the hospitality business, as much as the other guests, for example, you know, if someone goes, oh, well, they're not even going to have them. Say if a theatre and someone goes and they have got COVID really, and it spreads throughout the audience, what's going to happen then? And then this other guy was saying, well, if you only have them 2 days before, you often have to book things, you know, weeks ahead. So how, you know, it's riddled with difficulties both ways.
Thanks, Sudi. It's always nice to see you. I'm going to come to Nico in a second. I can see William. Jeremy's been allowed out of his cupboard. He's got his little yellow hand up. So I'll come to you too, William. But I do want to just pick up on a thought. It's not even occurred to me that Tanishq and Thomas and Daniel are talking about. Tanishq, you're talking about this thing to do with refunds. So the scenario is, I book to go and have a meal out or something like that, and then I go and do my test, and it comes back positive, but what happens to the money I've spent on securing the table or buying my ticket? That's the question.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that people will be more open to taking costs in terms of getting tested and everything if there's a cost imposed, if they're kind of guaranteed that either the money comes back to them or they can push it into some time later. Like, I remember back when like last year, when people had trips planned for the summer, I know people who got their deposit for a trip kind of pushed on so that they could like maybe push it over to when trips became allowed. So like if you paid a deposit, like a £50 deposit, you can push it on to like book for next trip. So if there isn't any kind of like security given in that sense, people are going to be very reluctant to going out and getting the tests, because if you can't really get your money back, and on the off chance that you do test positive, it's like a double whammy. So it doesn't really make sense.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we're quite used to that for booking a holiday, something big like booking a holiday. You're kind of used to it. Lots of us have been through it last year, but with a smaller thing, going to, I don't know, see a film or whatever, it's a sort of odd thing to think of making effectively a down payment against something that might not happen if you have your positive test. It's interesting to think it through. Nico McDonald, you're talking about privacy and trust, which I feel like we haven't quite got under the skin of. Are you there?
Yeah.
Hiya.
Hi there. Yeah, I posted in the chat an article by Janet Daly in the Telegraph on Saturday, and she was pointing out that for 50 years during the Cold War, we celebrated the freedom that we have in the West and the unfreedom, to use Matt's Orwellian derived term, in the Soviet bloc. And yet now we've given up freedoms. But, you can make understandable arguments for it. But in the last 12 months, I really haven't heard very few senior politicians or senior media figures argue for or interrogate people about the idea of freedom. And it's really interesting that, do we just not value freedom? Have we had freedom for so long that we've taken it for granted? Do we think the freedoms are given by the state and will be given back willingly, so it's not really a big issue? It's really vexes me. And I'm not saying the situation's bad, although it's hard to see how having more freedoms taken away than we did in World War II could be considered good. The other thing is trust. Do we trust ourselves? Do we believe we should be trusted? Are we citizens? Are we informed, upstanding, civil members of society? And do we not think that we should be trusted by the state and by our fellow citizens, and that we should be trusted to do the right thing? It doesn't mean everyone will do the right thing, but that is actually how society works by and large. It doesn't work based on rules and regulations, but on trust. And the last thing is bureaucracy, and how are we factoring in that we are introducing a bureaucratic layer to people's lives, people who are already stressed, poorer than they were, more under pressure and so on. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but we need to factor it in. And I would advocate an alternative, which is what the Great Barrington Declaration, much derided and suppressed by Google, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, advocated, which is shelter the vulnerable, which actually now is really only people who have chosen not to be vaccinated. Everyone else is really not vulnerable, at least not in a serious way. As it happens, that would benefit the younger, though I agree with someone in the chat, Lillian, that we shouldn't create a divide between young and old. But why not shelter the vulnerable? Let people self-isolate, as I've had to do for the last year, until they're in a position that they want to take the risk of taking part in society again.
So, Nico, just so I understand, in terms of introducing a system to make the easing of lockdown in the short term safer for everyone, which would involve the requirement to show, I don't know whether it's in an app or it doesn't matter on a card, I don't know, that you're COVID safe in theory, vaccine test, whatever. To you, that is a sort of that's a price for what you term freedom that's too high to pay in order to get everybody out of their houses again. Is that have I understood that? So in terms of the principle of the scheme, you think the price of freedom is too high?
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with your framing of it. I mean, I think it's not freedom, because we're having, it's like, you're having to get a pass. Like, someone pointed out on Radio 4 yesterday that when they were growing up, you had to get a pass to leave the Soviet Union. You had to get permission to leave the country. So, there was a freedom there of a sort, but when you have to ask the state to do something, it's not really freedom. So, I'm not against it. It's not like I'm lazy or something, but I just don't think freedom is given to us. It's something that we take and earn. And to be honest, I can't see why. Matt Ridley tweeted yesterday, there's so much advice that, things are still unsafe from SAGE. You'd think they don't believe in vaccines and they're actually anti-vaxxers. If we believe the vaccines work and most people who are vulnerable have had, both doses, then why should we not just let people self-isolate who still feel vulnerable?
So your alternative would be no system, unlock and off we go would be your sort of preferred alternative.
And to trust people. I think when you trust people, you find you get results that you wouldn't expect, because people actually live up to that trust. Not everybody, but most people. When you don't trust people, you get bad behaviors, which we've seen a lot from not least people like us who've been having dinner parties. I mean, not me, obviously, but, and meeting with more people than we should, and, going on mini breaks that we shouldn't, and going to our second homes and so on. When you trust people, I think you get unexpectedly good results. And when people have freedom, they behave better than when they don't have freedom.
Interesting. Thanks, Nico. William, with your hand up in not the cupboard today.
Oh, I'm enjoying the freedom of being let out of my cupboard for.
Yes, good, excellent.
It feeds into this whole idea of freedom and trust. And as we used to sing, this joyful Eastertide, away with sin and sorrow. So, but the whole thing is, I think, is that we are conflicted on several different layers. We are both what the Bible used to call a stiff-necked and disputatious people, right? And that was talking about the Old Testament version of what used to be called the children of Israel. But we're also freedom, so-called freedom-loving people as well. But what we've discovered, I think, in lockdown is that there is a sense, the sense of community being enhanced by the idea that we're not so free as we think we were to do X, Y, and Z. And if we restrain ourselves for the sake of others, that feeds into our own wider sense of being community minded as well. And that whole set of conflicted feelings was very much, if not our parents, certainly our grandparents' generation. And I think this was summed up by, funnily enough, Andrew Marr in one of his introductions for his Sunday morning show, when he said, perhaps we have discovered that we rather like being told what to do.
Yeah.
And he also said that even that, how did he call Boris? That disheveled libertarian, who was also found that being in charge, he has got other people to do the in charge stuff, the scientists, and he can still do his boosterism. And so this feeds very much into what Matt has been saying about the whole parliamentary thing about sunset clauses and so it's a broad thing, but this is not simple, as we know, but we're not simple beings, but we're a lot freer than the Soviet Union. And passes are not necessarily a restriction, but I think we've got to be careful all around the language we use around this. So maybe revisiting from an editorial point of view, revisiting some of the historical stuff, which puts this into a bit of perspective moving forward. Your average businessman will clearly, and business owner, and will clearly sign up to the idea of having a bit of paper if he or she can trade. So that's, you know, I mean, that's pragmatic. Now I'll stop because other people want to get in and you want to wrap up. But I hope some of that made sense.
Thanks.
Or is it me out of my cupboard slightly tropping, as it were?
Always nice to know when the members have been released. You're enjoying your newfound freedoms cupboard, which is good to see. I'm going to go to Levi, if I can. Levi Pay, who's joined in a few times in the chat, but I don't think I've spoken to you before, Levi. Are you there? Hiya.
Yeah. Hi there.
What do you make of all this?
Yeah, I just think all of this talk about prioritizing freedom just assumes that a level of segregation is possible that I just don't think is possible. So if we say that people either choose or are forced to self-isolate if they're vulnerable for whatever reason, and that's okay because that frees up the majority of people to live as they want to live, I just wonder how possible that is. If you take the example of a care home, for example, you can separate out a care home by not allowing visitors, but you still have to allow staff in. So if you allow the virus to travel more freely amongst young people who choose not to self-isolate, there's an inevitable amount of creep into even the most protected of settings. And I think that's the reason why, on balance, although obviously I passionately talk about freedom and how much we all want to be free, I think that in the end, if there's ever a time for government-led restrictions, it has to be during a pandemic, right? And I think some proportionate measures around vaccine passport certificates, whatever we call them, just feel right to me, and they feel timely. It's all about time limiting those measures and restricting the flow of information and the attachment of all these different bits of information about us, so they can't be joined up too much. But those are all practical issues that could be managed, I think. Yeah,
thanks, Levi. Nice to see you. And I think this is the thing, that's the difference between the principle, which I get is fraught, and the practicalities. The practicalities, if you agree with the principle, then you just have to check them off one by one. Have we dealt with that one? Have we dealt with that one? How do we limit the risk of this one? And I think also there's an interesting conversation going on between Andrew and Daniel too, in the chat. Andrew, good, we'll come to in a sec. That there's the zero risk scenario is a non-scenario. So all of this is presented in the context of, both collectively and individually, all of this is presented in that context. And perhaps we lose sight a little bit of that because we're so focused on when can we all do everything we want to again. You forget that will never be a thing. We might get into the stage of where we can pretty much go places we want to go to again with whoever we want to again. But that doesn't mean to say that it will be like it was before, where there was no risk. Are you there, Andrew? You'll say that much more better than I will. I hope he's there. Andrew,
Hi, yeah.
Hello.
Hi. Yes, so I mean, speculation on my side, but I believe across the UK there is a legal duty of care on businesses. And I think there's a non-zero, let's just call it non-zero chance that if there's no vaccine passport, somebody will sue a business on the grounds that they believe they caught COVID from the location or activities arranged by the business. And the business will have no way of saying, well, we did everything that was possible. And if they win, if the suer wins, and big businesses realize if people visit our restaurants or our cinemas or our pubs or even come into the office, we are liable for COVID claims, then I think that could have, well, that's a nightmare scenario.
How would somebody prove that they are, I caught my COVID in McDonald's?
It's the same way as they currently prove that they got food poisoning in McDonald's.
Oh, I see. They just say I went there and I didn't.
Yeah. So yeah. I imagine it will be a legal tussle extraordinaire, and I can see both sides getting help from interested parties. But if you just believe it's a non-0% chance, if you just think it's a 10% chance, then that is dramatic. absolutely dramatic. I can't see how the UK would ever be the same again.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to go back to Matt now, just because we started with him. I put you a bit on the spot at the beginning, Matt. I want to just have another go at this thing, what Nico was saying about freedom, and because it comes back to the beginning of why people reacted in the way that they did to the tweet that was worded in the way that it was, which is when you talk about freedom, privacy, trust, if we take that as the sort of, you know, the 3 points of the triangle, people seem to get very aerated, and it's hard for me to know really why. So what is the background, even to what Andrew Marr was drawing on with his disheveled libertarianism? What is the background to this sort of weird fetishization of freedom, as if it's something that British people are particularly bothered about? But are they? Where does that all come from? What is it even a thing, or is it a fake?
I don't think people are actually very bothered about freedom at the moment. I mean, people are less worried about freedom of speech at the moment than they have been for decades. I think in this context, freedom has become a proxy word, in the same way that during the Brexit debate, immigration became a proxy word for change. I think freedom has become a proxy word for our very understandable, you know, exhaustion, irritation, in all too many cases, grief at what we've been through in the last year. And there's the sensation that I sympathise with, that there's something impertinent about being told by the state that they're going to regulate how free you are. But the problem is that, all that aside, and with, you know, due deference to people's feelings, we're in the middle of a bloody pandemic. And getting out of it is going to be, and I thought what Chris said was really interesting, actually. You know, there's no guarantee that this is going to be a short haul. It could be, but getting out is going to be very messy and very tricksy. It always comes back to the point that this is a government, like all populist governments, that's good at winning campaigns and elections and bad at doing stuff, with the huge and wonderful exception of the vaccine rollout. And so my worry about this is that people's sort of emotional, visceral recoil from this will only grow. Now, it should be noted that all the polls, without exception, show 60 to 70% of people in favour of some system like this. So we have to be mindful of the self-selection fact. But I think if the proposed system carries on being presented in the candid way it was yesterday, that the kind of 30-ish, 40-ish% will actually grow, which would be only to the detriment of getting where I think we all want to be, which is to a healthy and liberated place where everyone could go about rediscovering what the hell they mean by normal, let alone living that normal.
So Matt, practically then, if 40 backbenchers aren't going to back it and Labour aren't going to back it,
yeah, it's dead at the moment.
What then? Well, everything we talked about becomes a non.
At the moment, it's dead. I mean, the implication of your question is absolutely right, that Johnson has to go back with Gove, who is sort of in charge of this whole process, and rethink it. And but as presently constituted, it doesn't have a majority in the House, and it should certainly have parliamentary approval. There's absolutely no question about that. So they've got a job ahead of them, and it's good. I mean, again, you know, to Chris's point about them learning, this is, you know, a good lesson for them. You have to get democratic backing for what you're doing, and the way that we do that in this country is through Parliament still. So make it work.
Interesting. I'm going to come to Maranisa Youssef, who's just been making a couple of comments. I haven't seen for a little bit of time. Are you there, Maranisa?
Yep. Sorry. I'm standing outside. I'm going to get this off for a moment.
That's okay.
I'm connecting from Zurich, by the way.
Oh,
which is I have this. It's the worst idea of being in a commuting relationship at that time, but I won't keep you with that. I think what I wanted to say was, as somebody who grew up in Pakistan and then moved to the UK, this question of freedom, like it's so tricky, especially now, because I keep thinking, and I'm not suggesting, by the way, that a pandemic means you abrogate rights. I think the most important thing is that we need more political engagement, because I feel like we've already ceded so much freedom, but we seem to be stuck on it in context of a medical and a, like a public health emergency. I don't have an answer, but I just feel that, because I'm feeling my way through this myself right now, and I also have some reservations on the use of, COVID vaccine passports, not least because of where the rollout is. But I do feel that we need to have a more nuanced debate on privacy and what it means in context of what these passports or these certificates will do, and what it means about the bigger threats to freedom, like freedom of speech, or the fact that certain people are subject to more control than others are, and we don't seem to care as much about that, but we're really hung up on the fact that, like, we have to give up this little bit of thing to get a little more. That tension is always going to be there in freedom. There's no unfettered freedom. So I think we need to move beyond that when thinking about this.
Melanie, so when you say we've already ceded so much of our freedoms, are you talking about the lockdown bit, or are you talking about something that predates that, or is bigger than
I'm
that?
talking about what predates it, Liz, because I think if you think about Facebook, for instance, and look, I'm guilty of it. I use Facebook, but I think it seems to be a bit of an odd debate to be having, that I want to, and because you're already, when you do an appointment, right, somebody's got a log somewhere, but you're giving that information willingly away to actors who are not even the state, and you're not holding them accountable, but you're pressing a different button on the state, which I think you should. But I think that there needs to be an understanding that in order to have maximum safety for people, you are going to have to make some changes to behavior. So I think it's very much in specific, like there's a longer arc of privacy that we've given up, but we're talking so much more about it in the context of the pandemic. And I'm not clear, as you said in the beginning, Liz, yourself, that where that, how that has come to pass, and whether we're asking the right questions, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you, Maronisa. It's been great to hear from everybody. It's a much bigger question than the practicalities of whether or not a vaccine certification system is going to work. There's obviously a relationship between freedom and privacy, but they're not the same. And there's also always a value exchange. Even in maximum freedom, there's a value exchange to be had, a sort of principles exchange of, if I have this freedom, what is expected of me? To what Nico was saying, if I have all this freedom, what's expected of me is that I will do the right thing by everybody. And Ellen made a remark in the chat, which I think is sort of deceptively simple but very insightful, which is what doing the right thing actually is right now is much more difficult to tell, especially as we sort of go through the phased onset of lockdown. So we will definitely return to this. We've hit 2:00. We'll watch closely what happens when this all goes to a vote anyway in Parliament, and see how the government continues to watch and learn. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I've enjoyed the conversation. I hope you have too, and do come back and join us tomorrow. We've not got so many think-ins this week because it's kind of all a bit post-Easter and people are busy with eggs and whatever else. But if you fancy coming back tomorrow evening to hear a bit more from Matt and some punk aristocracy, we'll be having a conversation, never mind the bigots. I'm very much looking forward to it. Maybe we'll talk about freedom then too, who knows. Dressing up is not compulsory. I'll see you tomorrow evening. Bye everyone.